Good morning. Yeah, my name is Ben Roberts, and I work at Liquid Intelligent Technologies. So, Liquid Intelligent Technologies, we've recently renamed from Liquid Telecom, which we've been known for many years. But we've built one of the biggest networks of infrastructure across Africa. So that's mostly fiber optic cable data centers. We've got about 100,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable now, and some of the largest data centers on the continent. We, now focusing on helping people use the digital infrastructure that we've built to really transform their businesses, transform, the way we do things in terms of digital transformation. But we're coming with cloud and helping people to use the technologies, the infrastructure that we've built. So that's in a summary, a high level what we do. But here in Kenya, we have a big network across the country, not fiber to mobile phones, but we connecting up to towers, buildings, institutions and schools and universities and things like that. There's quite a lot of players in the infrastructure of what I would call digital inclusion, and it starts with digital infrastructure. So as I said, we are the ones building fiber optic cable, connecting up data centers, and the way that networks are built, we talk of dividing into what we call the first mile, the last mile, and the middle mile. Right? So the first mile is the main fiber that comes in from cable landing stations into the main cities and connecting up the main data centers. So, we're very big in that. And then we have what we call the middle mile, which is connecting up all the remaining towns. So Liquid Telecom are also very big in that. Also, the government of Kenya have got a national fiber network, which connects up to some of the other towns in Kenya. Some of the power companies as well are in this space. And then when we get down to the what we call the last mile, we do this more in cities, and we do have some wireless base stations around. But in the last mile, it's the mobile operators who are servicing more people, more individuals on the last mile, and then we also have ISPs who are using some of our infrastructure in the last mile. But so really. Everybody has a piece to play in this, and then I'm talking just about the service providers, but there are other people who are having infrastructure as well. So I mentioned power companies, also have power, which is essential for broadband, but they have also fiber optic cable on their power lines. They're also tower companies. So a lot of the mobile operators have sold off their towers, and you have independent tower codes. But that's just in infrastructure. When it comes to digital inclusion, really, it's about digital services. Are people using, it's not just about have you got a data signal, it's about are you using the data signal. So it's the players in what we call the digital economy, and many, from people doing digital education, people doing digital services, people using apps for taxi hailing, and all these people, these are e-commerce. It's all part of what I would call the digital economy. And then, basically everybody's together in the same game. For digital inclusion, it's not just about having a data line, it's about having some data services to use that are relevant to you. But it's the way forward. We see that, we have to have governments acting together with private sector companies. We're seeing the link between education, particularly, and education at all levels as being key, and education needing to include digital skills. And we're seeing the curriculum of basic education is being reformed in Kenya. We're having the new curriculum coming in, which is a competency-based curriculum. this is bringing more digital enablement in all subjects. But that has to, flow through to all levels of education. We need to be turning out, graduates from universities, no matter what subject they're studying, they need to have the right digital skills. We need to be having a broad base of digital skills across the whole country, across the whole continent. So, there's a skilling part, and then the entrepreneurs and the innovators who are in the digital services space need to be creating digital services that are relevant to people. So, part of one of the reasons that the uptake of using data in rural areas is low is because potentially lack of relevant applications. So we're seeing a lot of companies moving into the space of digital agriculture, digital health, which are relevant to everybody, especially in rural areas if you're working in agriculture. So this is really important. Everybody, I see that in the success of the digital economy, that all the players are together, whether they be the service providers, the people doing infrastructure like us, the government doing e-services, getting people online, and then the digital service providers. So, really, it's all key. And I think, I think that's the way forward, basically. Yeah. So thanks. When we talk of digital skills, we talk of 3 layers of types of user, really. So one is what we would call basic digital literacy. That is the ability of people to use a mobile phone, access a web page, sign up on a web page for things, use digital services, use e-commerce. So this is the basic digital literacy skills, and this is key for everybody right now. I mean, if you want to fill in your tax returns in Kenya, the best way to do that is to go on the Kenya Revenue Authority website. So this is requiring, a level of basic digital skills that everybody needs. So this needs to become more ubiquitous, and services like the iTax is, I think, very key in getting people online. But we need to have, as I say, wider uptake of e-commerce and these things that everybody in Nairobi is using. We need to see some of these spread into more rural areas. And then we get to what I'd call the sort of mid-level skills, which is the sort of digital skills that every knowledge worker needs. If you're an accountant or a lawyer or any of these things, you need to be able to use the normal productivity tools for business, spreadsheets and word processing and databases. But that's extending now. People are starting to create their own apps in the business. So we see this level of digital skills for the professional workers. That's also got to increase as well. That makes us more efficient, right? That helps companies digitally transform. We've all been forced to go online much more in the last year, and we're seeing it's not just about Zoom calls and meetings, but it's about how you use digital tools to collaborate and be more efficient in the workplace. And then the top level skills as well is the highly skilled ICT professionals, and who are the ones who are configuring the systems, helping customers configure the systems, investing into tech and startups in Kenya. That needs to be expanded as well. And we're seeing, there's a gap here, but we're seeing a lot of people in this bracket maybe are taking jobs abroad. They may be sitting in Kenya, but they're doing online jobs abroad. The potential for this type of level of digital skilled people is really quite strong. So, there's you ask about examples, but a lot of companies are, a lot of the big global tech companies are working in this sort of top tier. Even us, we've got a program called 21C Skills, but we're helping people to, get these skills for the 21st century, looking at things like data science, machine learning, Internet of Things. These are the transformative technologies that are there. So, a lot of companies are educating in this space. But really, I think that, for me, it's got to start early. And a lot of what I've been focusing on is around connectivity in schools. We've done some big projects in Kenya for connecting schools with the Universal Service Fund from the Communications Authority. So putting in meaningful connectivity in places of education is where it starts. You know, if you have the connectivity, universities in Kenya are very well connected. We provide a lot of infrastructure for Kennet, but schools themselves are very few have got connectivity, and I think this is where there's scope for a lot of growth. It's something I'm working on very, very hard across the whole continent. But you know, that is everybody in the education sector, you know, needs to be thinking about how we actually educate people to do the jobs of tomorrow. And it's not just about, you know, turning out people from school or university the same way we have for the last 45 years. You know, we need to be equipping them with the tools in their toolbox to do some of these jobs that you know the jobs now that didn't exist, you know, 15 years ago or even less. And there'll be jobs, you know, graduates of today will be doing jobs, you know, in 5 years' time that don't exist today. So we need to be equipping people with the right skills. Thanks.
My name is Modani Mureithi. I'm the Senior Gender Policy Manager at the Web Foundation. So the Web Foundation was co-founded in 2009 by Sir Tim Berners-Lee. And as you know, Sir Tim Berners-Lee is the inventor of the World Wide Web. And he created this foundation to galvanize the global community to fight for the web we want, which is a web that is accessible, safe, and empowering for everyone. So we at the Web Foundation want to ensure that everyone will be affordably and meaningfully connected to the web, and that when they get online, they feel safe and empowered. The current state of the gender digital divide across the continent is still quite alarming. So for example, we find that globally, we have 48% of women online in comparison to 55% of men online. But when we break that down per continent, we start to see a variation. So for example, quick one. In Africa, we see that there's 20% of women online compared to 37% of men online. So we see there's a huge gender gap there. When we look at the Americas, so Latin America, Caribbean, and the whole Americas, we say that the gap is slightly smaller. So 77% of women online as compared to 76% of men online. When we look at the least developed countries in all these regions, because continents don't really tell us, you know, the global figures don't really give us the accurate picture because countries aren't in the same place. So when we look at the least developed countries, we find that the gap is bigger. So 50% of women online in comparison to 28% of men online. And we go to the island countries, we even find that the gap is about 21% compared to 33% of men online. So that's, I would say, the global picture. For us at the Web Foundation, we look at the gender digital divide in a couple of ways. We talk about meaningful connectivity, which means that it's not enough for you to have access to the internet, but you must have daily access to the internet. You have to have access to an appropriate device, so a smartphone. You have to have enough data, so unlimited broadband, either at home, at the place of work or study. And you must have a fast connection, so a 4G mobile connection. Why we emphasize this is we recognize that the usual target of access did not really address how people can meaningfully connect and be able to carry out activities online. So we advocate for meaningful connectivity as a target in itself to achieving, to reducing the gender digital divide. I think COVID-19 really drew out the realities of the gender digital divide, because the minute that many countries went on lockdown and everything was moved online, we started to see quickly who couldn't access and get online. So for example, when we talk about girls' education, we saw that a lot of girls, because they didn't have access to internet or a laptop, could not access education online. And that was a first, first demonstration of that. We also found that for women, especially women in the workplace, but also women in the informal sector. Because of the shutdowns, they were not able to move their businesses online as seamlessly as those who had access to the internet, especially mostly men. This was also impacted by the fact that a lot of them don't have digital skills or digital know-how on how to actually capitalize on digital business opportunities. So a lot of them were locked out of the opportunities and lost their income. We also saw that, especially for women in rural areas, women in very poor communities, being locked out and not having access to income or access to places where they could access the internet. They were completely locked out of accessing information. So an anecdotal example is that we worked with women in Bolivia, and one woman in Bolivia mentioned that once the lockdown was in place, she had to move to her home and stay locked in. And during that whole time of being locked in, she had no access to the internet. And that meant that she had no idea what was happening outside. She had no access to information about COVID. She had no access about how to go about it. She had no idea what was happening. So she was just stuck in her house. So this really tells you how important it is for everyone to have access to the web, especially women and girls and those who are really left out of the grid. So I think this is really an important fact for us, and we really advocate for governments putting in targets that will ensure everyone is meaningfully connected. So what I'll start with by saying is that the key barriers to the gender digital divide, one of it is affordability, the cost of the internet. So today we find that internet is still really expensive for a majority of people, especially for women and girls in poor or rural or marginalized communities. So we find that that's really the first barrier to connecting online. We find that even in rural areas, the gender digital divide is quite large. So for example, in our own research, we found that about 14% more men are most likely to be online compared to women in rural areas, meaning that women really aren't able to afford the internet. And as the Web Foundation, one of the things we've advocated for is a target around internet affordability. So this is the 1 for 2. So 1 for 2 means that for 1 gigabyte of mobile broadband, you should not pay more than 2% of the average monthly income. So we find that this is a good target for governments to set to allow majority of the people to be able to come online. And in Africa, and specifically, we found that about 14 out of the 48 African countries we've surveyed have reached this target of 1 for 2. So for example, Egypt, Mauritius, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, countries like Gabon, Nigeria, etc. So we find that this is a good target for countries to set. But even when we set the target, we find that because of the huge gender wage gap, women don't earn as much money as men, that women are still not being able to afford broadband and data. The other barrier we find is that lack of digital skills. So when we did our research in about 4 countries, which was Colombia, Uganda, Ghana, and Indonesia, one of the key things that came out was a lack of digital skills as a key barrier. And a lot of women mentioned that they didn't know how to use, the internet, or didn't know how to maneuver a smartphone. So this is a big issue that we find. The other one is safety online. A lot of women complain that they don't feel safe online. According to the Economist Intelligence Unit survey, we find that about 90% of women in Africa have reported being harassed and abused, whereas in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's about 91%. So those are quite high numbers. And what this does is it really makes women move away or exit digital platforms. The other thing is data protection and privacy related to online gender-based violence, but not only. Women are really concerned about how their data is being used. A lot of them don't trust that companies will secure their data. They're worried about their data being shared, especially things like private messages, personal information, images. So this is something that is quite concerning for most women. And what we see is that because of these concerns and barriers, women either will opt out of the platforms or opt out of being on the web, or will not participate fully on the internet. What I think is the best approach to addressing the gender digital gap is, first, we need to make sure that we have gender disaggregated data. One of the things we find at the Web Foundation, it's very hard for us to get correct data. And if we don't have the data, we can't develop policies that really reflect the lived experiences of people on the ground. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that governments should continue pushing for adopting a meaningful connectivity as a target for internet access. So making sure that they are meeting the UN target and enabling more people to be able to afford broadband internet. We also think that it's important that governments invest more in education around digital skills and literacy, especially by ensuring that they have national strategies to support technology education, innovation, and leadership for all women in all ages. And then we also need to ensure that governments are putting in place robust data protection laws that address the concerns and lived experiences of women. Often we find these are generic, and we have a one-fits-all type of methodology. But I think it's really important here that data protection ensures that people have autonomy and control over their data and how it's used. And lastly, we do need a very robust online gender-based violence laws and policies that protect women and girls from online harassment, but also laws that actually address the new and intricate ways that violence is happening online. I think the last remark for me is that we must understand that what we're seeing online is a reflection of what we live offline. So the gender digital inequalities we're seeing reflect the gender inequalities we live. And I think that's important for us to think about when we think about talking about tech, especially on the African continent. So for me, we must really address the patriarchal norms and social norms that reinforce gender inequality, that create barriers for women inclusion and participation in the digital economy, but also participating online. I think that's gonna be where we really make huge changes. So we should never forget that our online lives are a replica of our offline lives, and whatever inequalities we're facing are being replicated online.
My name is Lona Nyandat. I'm head of legal and regulatory affairs at ATC Kenya. So ATC Kenya is a subsidiary of American Towers Corporation, which is an entity that is listed in the New York Stock Exchange in New York. So we are a passive infrastructure company, and we hold an NFP Tier 2 license that is issued by the Communications Authority of Kenya. So within the Kenyan market, we are an independent owner, operator, and we are licensed as a developer of wireless communications infrastructure. And currently we have about 2,600 sites across all the 47 counties in Kenya. Over the past decade, I think there have been various developments within the Kenyan market with respect to digital infrastructure. So the first thing is in relation to the unified licensing framework. So as most of you might know, about a decade ago, the Communications Authority of Kenya decided to basically adopt a principle of technology neutrality. So what this meant is that for operators, the new ULF framework decided to change and shift how the market was being licensed. So the previous regime, we had a separate license that was required with respect to each type of service. So under the ULF, what happened is that we had an operator being issued with a license for a specified market segment to provide any type of communication service. So that meant that operating within the Kenyan market became quite simple. Other developments that have happened since then are in relation to infrastructure sharing. We have the IACO model guidelines for collocation and infrastructure sharing. Within Kenya, we also have under the Kenya Information and Communications Act, a provision that basically provides for encouragement of infrastructure sharing within the Kenyan market. Then we have other regulations that also deal with infrastructure sharing. One of them is in relation to interconnection and provision of fixed lines. And those regulations essentially encourage both passive and active infrastructure sharing within Kenya. So from a policy perspective, we also have various policies that basically promulgate infrastructure sharing. So we have the National Broadband Strategy. We also have the Digital Economy Blueprint, which basically focuses as one of its pillars on infrastructure, on digital infrastructure. Another progress of digital infrastructure across Kenya has actually been in relation to USF. This is the Universal Service Fund. Over the past decade, licenses have been contributing 0.5% of their gross annual turnover towards USF. So USF is used, to deploy infrastructure in both unserved and underserved areas. And most recently, in February of this year, we had USF being allocated to passive infrastructure companies, such as America Tower Corporation in Kenya. Another development over the past decade within the digital infrastructure space has been specialized services being offered through the tower companies. So these tower companies include companies such as ATC Kenya. So this started about 6 years ago when Eaton Towers Kenya Limited actually entered the market, and the company was subsequently acquired by ATC Kenya. So those are the developments that have happened within the Kenyan market within the past 10 years. So I think the first thing that the government can do is actually in expansion of the national broadband coverage. Currently, I think there are tremendous opportunities for government to increase usage of digital infrastructure and access to digital services and digital assets in order to spur growth. So another area that I think the government can help extend connectivity is actually by encouraging infrastructure sharing. So this is something that I think across most markets in Africa is already being done, but it is still not as prevalent as in the West. So as I mentioned previously, we have the IACO model guidelines on co-location and infrastructure sharing, which essentially act as a framework in terms of how infrastructure sharing can be undertaken. Even in Kenya, we have guidelines that deal with infrastructure sharing, in particular the interconnection guidelines, which encourage infrastructure sharing for both passive and active infrastructure. So within our market, particularly passive infrastructure sharing is quite common, but active infrastructure sharing is not yet common. So I think the government can play an active role in encouraging active infrastructure sharing. Another aspect in terms of how the government can help extend connectivity is in relation to investment in supporting enabling infrastructure. So as most of you might be aware, we have in most African countries very poor road access networks. There are so many areas that do not have power connectivity. Supporting other supporting infrastructure such as hospitals, schools are also not in certain parts of the country. So with that, it means that for a mobile network operator or for a tower company to want to go and build a tower in a certain location, the expense, the capital expenditure that it would have to spend would be quite high, because the potential return on investment would actually be quite low. So the government can actually enhance this by getting populations to move and actually settle in certain parts of the country by having road access networks, in those particular areas, by having power in those particular areas, because power is what is actually used to power up infrastructure, active infrastructure for MNOs. So with such enabling infrastructure being put in place, it actually makes it easier for the tower companies and for the MNOs who want to deploy their infrastructure in certain places to actually move into those places. Another incentive that the government can probably do in terms of encouraging particularly the private sector to deploy their infrastructure in certain areas that are unserved and underserved is in relation to offering licensing rebates. So it's quite expensive, of course, to deploy infrastructure. So if you require an MNO or a tower company to deploy its infrastructure in a particular locality, then it would be an incentive for them to go to those locations. If at all, for example, they get a licensing fee rebate, which is a certain percentage. If at all they're given tax incentives, for example, a reduction in corporate tax, so such things are able to, also encourage the the private sector to, work hand in hand with the government and deploy infrastructure in certain locations. So policy interventions can actually be also a good mechanism for the government, to sort of like accelerate deployment of connectivity, and policy interventions. This is not only policy interventions that deal with designation of telecommunications as critical national infrastructure. There are also other interventions that can be done, So for example, in relation to having like a proper data protection frameworks, which basically like encourage people to use connectivity more and more without fearing that their data can be hacked, and or fearing instances of cybercrime activities being undertaken. Lastly, I think entry barriers actually act as a deterrent for the government having partnerships, particularly with the private sector. I think particularly the local shareholding obligations that most of the African states have put in place, and in particular Kenya, we have a local shareholding obligation, which is 30%, actually acts as a deterrent for anyone who'd want to invest in our market. And as the government expands and tries to enter into private-public partnerships with various entities, especially for purposes of ensuring universal access, this is something that can act as a hindrance. So through removal of such entry barriers, which essentially do not allow for having a conducive legal and regulatory framework within which our market operates, then the government would not be able to attract the right partners, to help them accelerate deployment of infrastructure within the country.
My name is Barak Otieno. I am a trustee of the Kenya ICT Action Network. My focus is on internet infrastructure and policy at the network. The Kenya ICT Action Network is a think tank composed of people and institutions interested and involved in policy development, specifically ICT policy network in Kenya. In fact, for the longest time, its tagline has been catalyzing access to ICTs. And some of the memorable developments or some of the memorable deliverables that KITANET has coordinated in Kenya has been the ICT policy in 2006, and also just bringing together stakeholders to again review the same in 2015, 2016. The barriers to digital inclusion include access to infrastructure, affordable infrastructure, digital literacy, and policy that ensures or guarantees that the unserved and the underserved are actually able to get the benefits of infrastructure. As it is currently, you find that private sector is the key player with regards to digital inclusion, and they mostly focus on places where they can be able to get a return on their investment. To be able to participate actively in the digital sphere, a lot of resources have to be spent, just the way we spend a lot of money constructing roads. And so you find that in most cases, government priorities may not necessarily be focused on ensuring that there is digital inclusion because there are other key issues like health that take center stage when it comes to apportioning of budgets and the likes. So as such, you find that as a result, mostly the urban areas are the ones that are served, because in the urban areas, citizens are able to pay. And you then find gaps that come up, which then alienate some citizens from accessing government services and from accessing the benefits of the economy in the nation. Maybe to bring the point home, I would say, for example, if you look at internet connectivity, you would find that internet connectivity is concentrated in the main cities or the main towns. The reason is simple: return on investment. In the cities and in the towns, people are able to pay, or rather to set aside some of their disposable income to be able to pay for internet connectivity. So when you find a scenario where government services, which are supposed to be available and accessible to all citizens, are then being put on digital channels or are being put on online channels, you find that people who are outside the city are then unable to access these government services, which creates a digital gap. And these are some of the challenges that digital inequalities can be able to create. So what the Kenya ICT Action Network has been doing on this front is that from the time it came into being around 2005 or 2006, it has purpose to bring together stakeholders so that we are able to attain universal connectivity across the country. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the first things that was key for a country like Kenya, of course, was the ICT policy, because the ICT policy identified key areas that needed focus from government, from private sector, from civil society, from academia. And over the years, there's been a lot of effort or push to make sure that most of these key areas are addressed. One of the other things that I'll talk about, which the Kenya ICT Action Network has done, is from 2008, specifically October, it started convening the Kenya Internet Governance Forum, which again focused on bringing stakeholders key to development and expansion of the internet in Kenya on the table to discuss on equal footing things that needed to be done so that citizens can be able to enjoy the fruits of digital connectivity. Through the Kenya Internet Governance Forum, there's been focus on infrastructure. In the first years, that is between the year 2008 and the year 2012, Kenya was fairly underdeveloped with respect to the reach and depth of infrastructure across the country. And so there was a lot of focus to ensure that there's infrastructure around the country. And some of the key conversations and outputs in that particular period were, for example, the creation of the national optic fiber infrastructure, which again was a fruit of collaboration by various stakeholders in the nation. Right now, we have moved a notch higher, and at Kenya ICT Action Network, we are talking about community networks, meaning that the various phases of the national optic fiber infrastructure have not been able as such to make sure that the unserved and underserved have been connected to the internet. So we've gone a notch higher to make sure that those that have not been reached can now be able to be reached. The other point is access to affordable devices is also a very important issue. And how is the Kenya ICT Action Network dealing with this? Through lobbying, so that taxes on digital devices, again, can be either scrapped off, or if they have to be there, then they have to be taxes that may not limit the local citizen from accessing some of those devices. The other point is content. Again, in most of the rural areas, our citizens are not primarily English speaking. And so content has to also be delivered in a language that they understand. And there's also the issue of accessibility. So we also have to consider new issues like sign language and probably devices that can be able to make sure that our brothers and sisters that are differently abled are also able to access this content. Policy is key in that it highlights the high-level lines, for lack of a better word. The digital economy requires different stakeholders for it to be effective or for it to be able to work. You know, just like when we look at basics of computing, there's the hardware and there's the software bit. But to bring it further home, there's a role for citizens or people There's a role for the problems or processes that we are answering, and there's the role for technology. So I think these are some of the areas that I would propose that policy really needs to focus on. And we have to be deliberate and intentional, because at the end of the day, we are talking about universal access, meaning that no one should be left behind. So technology should not really dictate our lives. It is the human beings or the citizens or the people who need to dictate their lives using technology as a tool. And so any policy interventions have to look across these particular areas that we have mentioned. And again, this is what KictaNet is all about. Currently, our tagline is powering communities, and we are looking at interventions across all those spheres that I have mentioned to make sure that nobody is left behind in the digital world. Thank you.
Very good day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be part of this event where I will talk a little bit about 5G, the challenges and the opportunity. My name is Bello Musa. I am the head of innovation and ICT strategy for Huawei Southern Africa. I'm based in Johannesburg. Well, a little bit about Huawei. We are present in more than 50 countries in Africa, more than 9,000 employees, where more than 75% of these employees are local. So we do make use of a lot of local manpower. And as you can see from the map, we have a presence from different area. It could be ICT Academy, could be a network operating center, technical assistance centers, and also global service resource centers. All these are distributed equally around Africa based on the different resources that each and every country is providing. While Huawei main activity is focusing on devices, of course, connectivity, computing, and cloud. We provide solutions and product to three main customer group. There is what we call a carrier group, and enterprise, which include governments, and of course, devices. So this is in a nutshell what Huawei does. Well, talking about 5G, which is the fifth generation of mobile technology. 5G is we call it is the revolutions of mobile technology with a lot of applications, new platforms, and of course new opportunities. So the era of 5G would be a combination of cloud computing, artificial intelligence, that will directly lead us to a better connected world where everything is sensing, everything is connected, and everything is intelligent. So there is a lot of opportunities around 5G. 5G will definitely revolutionize the way we communicate. Well, there are a lot of services around 5G, a lot of use case, a lot of user scenarios. When you look at the chart on the left, this is the ITU chart that divided the 5G capability into three categories: the enhanced mobile broadband, ultra reliable low latency communication, and massive machine type communication. So all of these scenarios require a specific amount of specific type of characteristics on a 5G. So 5G definitely should have a much better capability than the IMT Advanced, which is a 4G. So you can clearly see here on the right hand side the different characteristics compared to 4G. While you have a higher throughput, of course, 10 megabit, and the peak data is 20 gig. The user experience will reach 100 Mbps per second. spectrum efficiency, mobility support for 500 kilometers an hour, at a very, very low latency, which is 1 millisecond. And of course, the number of connection per square meters is also very, very high. We're talking around 1 million devices per square meters. So these characteristics of a 5G, implementing them comes with challenges. So these are some of the challenges that we have to foresee in deploying 5G. First and foremost, is the spectrum ready? Is it available? Is it accessible? The license cost for the operators, the devices, and the services. So these are the main challenges when it comes to 5G implementation and deployment in Africa or around the world. Well, starting from a spectrum, 5G will require at least 80 to 100 megahertz of spectrums in different bands. So what we have seen so far is many countries have allocated the C-band, the 2.6, and of course the lower band. So we see the case of China, European Union, and then the United States. So in Africa here, so far the countries that have allocated the spectrum have done that on the C-band, but we still have a long way to go to allocate 5G spectrums. And again, when it comes to the 5G spectrums allocation, a large and contiguous spectrums allocations will be very, very essential. Why? Because that will help save, the cost of a network deployment. So you can see here on the right-hand side that if an operator is even 100 megahertz instead of 60 megahertz, this operator will definitely benefit by 64% of the number of sites deployment decrease. So large contiguous spectrums is a very important. Another very important aspect is the cost of the 5G spectrums. So we have seen in the past how spectrum has been very, very costly, namely for 2G, 3G, and even 4G. So if we want to really have a 5G deployment beneficial for end user, regulator have to take a big consideration onto the spectrum cost. So how do we define this spectrum cost? There is a formula developed by a very renowned consulting firm called Caliago Consulting, where the spectrum price index is proportional to the ARPU revenue by subscriber. So this guides the operator to provide a very acceptable price for the spectrums. Apart from spectrums, we believe also that there should be additional condition on the spectrum, namely the obligation. So here we'll talk about some of the consideration. Of course, the guarantee of coverage. What we have seen with previous technology is most of the operator prioritize the rural, the urban area when it comes to network deployment, and then they leave the rural or urban area underserved or even unserved. So with the 5G, we require that there should be certain conditions like guarantee of coverage that comes with the license, and also the spectrum has to be technology neutral, meaning that the spectrum can be applied to every technology. And of course, regulator can also require a better user experience by guarantee of speed, and also by reducing fragmentation when it comes to the spectrum deployment. So in a nutshell, for successful spectrum policy when it's come to 5G, we have a technology neutral, large spectrum blocks, coverage, and capacities. These are some of the elements that will need to be considered. So for 5G spectrum considerations, of course, there are ranges of spectrums. So 5G spectrums primary bands will be C-band, 2.6 band, or 2.3. And at this 80 to 100 megahertz of spectrum, of contiguous spectrum block per network. And when it comes to the spectrum price, it has to use the rationale of market-based valuation. And of course, the regulatory can add up some obligations in terms of coverage and also in terms of a capacity, taking into consideration that the traffic will be growing, and there should be also some allocation on the new band, like for instance the millimeter waves, the 6 gigahertz and above. Another element is the infrastructure sharing. We have seen a lot of challenges when it comes to site acquisition and site deployment in the 4G, 3G, and 2G era, and this has hindered a lot the development of mobile telecommunication, especially the mobile coverage. And you know, with the 5G, we'll need more sites, maybe 3 times the number of sites of 2G, 3G. So where are these sites going to come from? So I think the simple answer here is to encourage the infrastructure sharing, where operators or telecoms company can make use of existing infrastructure like streetlight poles, building, rooftop building, traffic light, you name it. So here there should be a very tight collaboration between municipalities and operators, telecom service providers, to be able to reuse the existing infrastructure. This will save not only time, but will also save the cost of deployment, which will in return also be transferred onto the consumers. So this will make consumers services, 5G services, more affordable. Another very important aspect and challenge on the 5G is about security. We're talking a lot about massive machine type communication, so the security will be a big issue. 5G, unlike 4G, will come with an array of security, from the cryptography, the privacy protection, the interconnection security, and also the area interface security. But nevertheless, from the country level, regulators should also reinforce the implementation of this security mechanism to make 5G more secure and more robust. So for the 5G development, we believe that a good policy when it comes to spectrums, user migrations, good legislations, regulations, affordability, and planning will be very, very important to for the 5G development in Africa. So here we talk about tax incentives, you know, some kind of subsidies from the government, and some considerations over ICT import duties. So these are certain things that will really boost the development of 5G in Africa. So while the road for 5G is very promising, is very clear, and for us to really benefit of this new technology, we have to take into account, you know, certain things and tools like spectrums, some approvals, you know, easing of approval procedures. You have to take some initiatives like building up platforms, data sharing, and of course we have to think about public-private partnerships, and also some incentive when it comes to tax and fundings. Thank you very much.